The dust on the main road of Caldwell, Kansas had barely settled when the stranger's horse came into view on the crest of the hill, silhouetted against the fierce orange sun of an August evening in 1883, and every soul who happened to glance up from their business felt something shift in the air, as though the town itself recognized the man before any of its people did. His name was Cole Reardon, and he had been gone for exactly 10 years. He sat tall in the saddle the way he always had, broad through the shoulders and lean at the waist, wearing a dusty canvas duster that had seen hard miles and harder weather. His hat was pulled low against the dying sun, but the angle of his jaw and the set of his mouth were unchanged, even after a decade of whatever the world had done to him. His horse, a roan gelding named Ranger that nobody in Caldwell had ever seen before, picked its way carefully down the hill toward the rutted Main Street, as though sensing that every step forward was one step deeper into a story that was not yet finished. Cole had been 24 years old when he left. He was 34 now, and the difference showed not in weakness but in weight, the kind of weight that settles into a man's eyes and does not come from age alone. He had ridden from Colorado, where he had spent the last several years working cattle drives and doing the kind of quiet, honest work that a man does when he is trying to outrun a ghost. Before Colorado, there had been Texas. Before Texas, there had been a stretch of months in New Mexico territory that he preferred not to think about. But always, in the back of every thought and behind every quiet evening around a campfire, there had been Caldwell. And always, in every quiet evening, there had been her. Her name was Mae Whitfield, and she was 26 years old and the proprietor of the only boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, a 2-story white-painted structure on the corner of Kishom Street that her mother had built, and her mother had left to her when she passed 3 winters prior. Mae ran it alone, took in travelers and railroad men and the occasional cattle buyer, cooked 3 meals a day in a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and wood smoke, and kept her books with the kind of careful precision that had surprised everyone in town who had underestimated her when she first took over, which was nearly everyone. She had been 16 when Cole first told her he loved her. He had been 20, fresh from 2 seasons of trail work, and feeling like the whole world was wide open before him. They had sat together on the porch of her mother's boarding house on a warm September evening in 1869, the stars thick as cream overhead, and Cole had said the words with such earnest terror in his voice that Mae had laughed before she could stop herself, and then cried a little, and then kissed him for the first time. They had kept company for 4 years after that. 4 years of Sunday suppers and long evening walks and letters written, when the trail took Cole away for months at a time. 4 years of every kind of sweetness, and the kind of arguing that comes only between people who care deeply about each other, and every quarrel had always ended with his arms around her and her face against his chest, both of them breathing slowly back into each other. Then, in the summer of 1873, Cole Reardon had saddled his horse and ridden out of Caldwell before sunrise one morning and had not come back. He had not even said goodbye. He had left a letter. 2 pages, written in his careful, uneven hand, full of words like restless and obligation, and not good enough, and you deserve better than a man who cannot settle. Mae had read the letter so many times in those first weeks that the paper had gone soft along the folds. Then she had put it in the cedar box under her bed where she kept the things she did not want to see but could not bring herself to throw away, and she had gone on living, because that is what a person does. She had received 2 more letters over the years. One from Texas in 1875, brief and careful, saying he was well and working hard and hoped she was doing the same. One from Colorado in 1879, even briefer, saying he thought about Caldwell sometimes. She had not written back to either of them, because she would not know what to say that was honest and also bearable. The letters went into the cedar box with the first one. The cedar box stayed under the bed, and Mae had gone on. She had learned the boarding house business, had taken in her mother's recipes and made them her own, had added a second-floor room and improved the stable out back. She had been courted twice by men who were decent enough and had said all the right things. She had turned both of them down with a quiet kindness that left them puzzled, because she herself could not fully explain why she turned them down except that some part of her had never quite closed the door that Cole Reardon had walked out of. She had not pined openly. She had not wept in public or spoken his name carelessly. She had simply continued to love him in the deep, quiet way that a river continues to run beneath a winter freeze, patient and cold, and absolutely certain of its own nature. So when Mae Whitfield stepped out of the boarding house kitchen door that August evening in 1883 to dump a pan of dishwater into the yard, and she looked up to see a tall man on a roan horse coming down Kishom Street, and the man took off his hat to wipe his forehead, and the last light of the sun fell across his face, the pan slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a sound like a gunshot. She did not move. She could not move. Cole turned his head at the sound, and their eyes met across 40 feet of dusty Kansas evening, and the whole world seemed to pull itself to a halt and hold its breath. He had not known for certain she would still be here. He had told himself, on the long ride from Colorado, that she might have married long since, that she might have moved away, that the boarding house might belong to strangers. He had told himself he was coming back only because he had purchased a small piece of land just north of town from a man in Colorado who had inherited it, and he needed to see to the deed, and Caldwell was simply where that land was. He had told himself many things that were not entirely true. But nothing he had told himself had prepared him for the sight of her standing in the yard of the Whitfield boarding house with an empty pan at her feet and 10 years of complicated history in her eyes. Mae was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, but now it was a different kind of beautiful, not the soft prettiness of a young girl, but something fuller and more considered, a beauty that had been tested and had held. Her dark hair was pinned up under a white cloth, and she wore a plain blue dress with an apron over it, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they stopped believing in, suddenly standing in front of them. Cole swung down from Ranger. His boots hit the street. He held his hat in both hands the way he always had when he was nervous, rolling the brim slowly between his fingers. "Me," he said. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she bent and picked up the pan from the ground with a steady hand and straightened up and looked at him squarely. "Cole Reardon," she said. Her voice was even. "I thought you were dead." "I am not dead," he said, which was all he could think of to say, and he hated himself for it the moment the words left his mouth. "I can see that," Mae said. She turned and went back into the kitchen. He stood in the street for a moment, holding his hat. Then he tied Ranger to the post at the edge of the yard and followed her, stopping at the kitchen door because he was not sure he had the right to simply walk in. She was at the stove when he came to the doorway, stirring something with a long wooden spoon, her back to him, her spine very straight. "There are 2 empty rooms," she said without turning around. $1 a week, meals included. Same terms as always if you are looking for a place to stay. "Me, the stable out back has room for your horse, hay and water included in the rate. I did not come here just to rent a room." She turned around then, and he saw it just for a moment, just a flicker behind her composed and careful eyes, all of it. The hurt and the years and the waiting that she had never admitted to. It was there and then it was gone again, locked away behind the calm face she had learned to wear. "Then what did you come here for, Cole?" she asked. He opened his mouth and could not answer, not yet, not with the right words. There were so many things he needed to say, and none of them would come in the right order. "I will take the room," he said finally, "if that is all right." $1 a week, Mae said, and turned back to her stove. The boarding house had 5 other guests that week, which meant that supper was a full table. A railroad surveyor named Henderson, a traveling dry goods merchant named Pitts, 2 cattle buyers from Wichita whose names Cole did not catch on the first evening, and an older woman named Mrs. Carvey who was passing through on her way to visit family in Oklahoma Territory. Mae set the table and brought out bread and a pot roast that smelled like it had been cooking all day, and she moved around the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this 1,000 times, speaking pleasantly to her guests, refilling glasses, answering Henderson's questions about the town's railroad prospects with genuine knowledge and opinions that clearly surprised him. Cole sat at one end of the table and watched her and felt the years like a physical weight on his chest. She sat down last at the far end of the table and asked Mrs. Carvey to say grace, and through the whole of supper she spoke to everyone at the table with perfect evenness and spoke to Cole not at all except to ask once whether he wanted more bread, which he did, and she passed the basket to Henderson to pass down to him so she would not have to reach across the table herself. After supper the guests dispersed and Mae began clearing the table. Cole stayed in his chair. "You do not need to sit there," Mae said, stacking plates with her back to him again. "I know that," Cole said. "I wanted to talk to you. I have dishes to do. I could help." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him over her shoulder with an expression he could not quite read. "You want to wash dishes?" she asked. "I want to talk to you," he said. "I will wash dishes while I do it." A long pause. Then she said, "The basin is on the counter," and carried the stack of plates through to the kitchen. They washed the supper dishes side by side, Mae washing and Cole drying, and he told her where he had been. Not everything, not all at once, but the broad shape of it. Texas first, working for a cattle outfit out of San Antonio, then moving on because he had always been moving on, New Mexico territory, and some years he had not been proud of, and then Colorado, where he had finally found a rhythm that felt close to peace. He told her about buying the land north of town, 40 acres that he meant to run cattle on if he could put together a small herd, which he thought he could, and about how he had sat in a lawyer's office in Denver watching the deed being drawn up and had known, with a certainty that was almost physical, that it was time to come home. Mae did not ask questions. She washed and she listened and he talked, and the kitchen was warm and close around them, and outside the windows the Kansas night was full of crickets. When the dishes were done she dried her hands on her apron and looked at him directly. "Why did you not write?" she asked. "After those first 2 letters, it has been 4 years since I heard anything from you." "I did not know what to say," Cole said. "That is not a good enough reason." "No," he agreed. "It is not." "And the leaving," she said, and her voice was still even, but there was something beneath it, something carefully controlled. 10 years ago, the letter you left, you said you were not good enough. What does that mean, Cole? What does that mean after 4 years of keeping company?" "I meant it," he said. "At the time I meant every word of it. I was 24 years old and I had no land and no money and no prospects beyond another man's cattle drive, and I thought you deserved a man who could give you something real." "I did not ask you for something real," Mae said. "I asked you for nothing at all except yourself." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I know that now," Cole said. "You knew it then too," Mae said quietly. "You were afraid, that is what it was. You were afraid of something and you left instead of staying and working through it, and that is the truth of it whether you are ready to say so or not." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is the truth of it." Mae nodded once as though the confirmation of something she had already known was still necessary to hear aloud. Then she untied her apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and said, "Breakfast is at 7. Good night, Cole." She went upstairs, and he stood alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low on the counter, and he thought that he had deserved every word of that, and that she was the finest person he had ever known, and that he had been a tremendous fool. He slept poorly that first night. The room she had given him was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the dark backyard and the stable beyond, and he lay on the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, a dog barking far off, the distant sound of piano music from Duffy's saloon 2 streets over, the occasional creak of the old building around him. He thought about what she had said. He had been afraid. It was so simple when stated plainly, and so enormous when you had lived inside it. He had been afraid of failing her, afraid of the way love could become a chain, could hold you to a place and an expectation, could define you in ways that felt suffocating even when they were also sweet. He had seen what happened to his own father, who had loved his mother and stayed and worked himself to hollow trying to keep a family on bad land, and had died angry and empty. Cole had not wanted to become that. So he had run from the thing that might have turned him into it, not understanding that in running from one kind of failure, he had simply chosen another. Breakfast at 7 meant me was up by 5, and when Cole came downstairs at 6:30, the kitchen was already warm and smelling of coffee and bacon and fresh biscuits. Me was at the stove, and she handed him a mug of coffee when he came in as naturally as breathing, the way she had done 100 times years ago, and for a moment it was as though the decade between then and now simply did not exist. "Thank you," he said, and wrapped both hands around the mug. "There is a task I need done this morning if you are inclined," she said, and her voice was businesslike but not unkind. "One of the porch boards on the front of the house has rotted through. Henderson nearly went through it yesterday. I have a spare plank in the stable, but I have not had time to replace it." "I can do that," Cole said. "There are tools in the stable as well, left side when you go in. I will take care of it before breakfast." He found the tools and the spare plank and worked on the porch while the town came slowly to life around him. Merchants opening their shutters, the blacksmith 2 streets down beginning his morning work, a wagon loaded with feed sacks rolling past on its way to the grain exchange. Several people noticed him as they passed. A few he recognized from 10 years ago. Tom Garrett, who ran the hardware store, now considerably grayer, raised a hand in tentative greeting. Old Hector Bliss, who had been old even then and was now ancient, sat in his chair outside the barber shop across the street and watched Cole work with a narrow, speculative expression that did not change when Cole nodded at him. Word would be around town by noon. Cole Reardon was back. He had known that would happen and was ready for it. He finished the porch board and was washing his hands at the pump in the yard when me called through the kitchen window that breakfast was ready. He came in and joined the other guests at the table, and me brought out eggs and bacon and biscuits and a bowl of preserves, and the conversation was general and easy in the way of strangers sharing a table, and Cole ate and listened and felt something in his chest begin, very gradually, to loosen. After breakfast, as the other guests dispersed to their various errands, Cole helped me carry the plates to the kitchen without being asked. She glanced at him when he came through the door with a stack of plates, and the glance held something softer than the evening before, though she said nothing about it. "I need to go to the land office today," Cole said. "Register the deed on that acreage. Will you be here this evening?" "I am always here," me said, and there was nothing pointed in it, just a statement of fact, and yet it landed against his ribs like a quiet arrow. "Then I would like to talk more if you are willing." She considered this for a moment, washing a plate in slow circles. "I am willing," she said. The land office was on the south end of Main Street, next to the sheriff's office, and the man behind the desk was a fat, pleasant fellow named Dobbs who handled Cole's paperwork with brisk efficiency and had the deed registered within the hour. Cole's 40 acres lay north of town along the creek, good grass land with reliable water, and Dobbs told him the previous owner had tried to farm it for 2 seasons before giving up and heading back east, which meant there was already a small cabin and a modest corral on the property, which was more than Cole had hoped for. On his way back up Main Street, he stopped into Garrett's Hardware because he needed to price out fencing materials, and Tom Garrett came around the counter with a genuine smile and a hand to shake. "Cole Reardon," Tom said. "I heard you were back. God almighty, man, how long has it been?" 10 years, Cole said. 10 years, Tom repeated, shaking his head. "You look well. You look a little beat up, but well." They talked for 20 minutes about fencing and cattle and the state of the range north of town, and Tom was forthcoming with information and prices without being nosy about Cole's reasons for returning. Cole appreciated this. Not everyone would be so considerate. The first person who was not considerate was Walt Sayers, who had been one of Cole's oldest acquaintances in Caldwell and who had clearly been waiting for him, because he came out of the barber shop just as Cole was passing and fell into step beside him with a friendliness that had an edge to it. "Heard you were back," Walt said. "Heard you were staying at Mae Whitfield's place." "I am," Cole said. "That is interesting," Walt said, "seeing as how you are the one who left her." "I know what I did," Cole said, keeping his voice level. "She had a hard couple of years after you went," Walt said. "Her mother took sick and she ran that boarding house by herself. Nobody to help her. She did it fine because she is me and me does everything fine, but you should know that." "I appreciate you telling me," Cole said, and meant it, even though Walt's manner was not gentle. Walt stopped walking and looked at him with the squinting directness of a man who wants to make sure he is being understood. "She is a good woman, Cole. She has been good to this town and good to everyone in it. If you are back here to make her care about you again and then leave her again, then you need to turn that horse around today." "I am not going to leave her again," Cole said. "You sound sure," Walt said. "I am sure," Cole said, and something in his voice must have conveyed the depth of it because Walt held his gaze for a long moment and then nodded once. "All right then," Walt said and walked back toward the barber shop. Cole spent the afternoon at his land, riding out with Ranger along the creek to walk the boundaries and look over the cabin, which was small but sound, and the corral, which needed some repair. He sat on a flat rock by the creek in the late afternoon and looked at the land around him, the tall grass moving in the August wind, the cottonwoods along the water, the big Kansas sky reaching from one edge of the world to the other, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was that he was where he was supposed to be. He rode back into town at supper time, put Ranger up in the stable, brushed him down and gave him grain, and came into the boarding house through the back door to find me at the kitchen table going over her account books with a pencil in her hand and a small furrow between her brows that meant she was concentrating. She looked up when he came in. "The cabin is habitable," he said. "It will need some work, but it is a sound structure." "I heard old Peabody built it," Mae said. "He was a decent builder even if he was a poor farmer." "He was," Cole agreed. He poured himself a mug of water from the pitcher on the counter and leaned against the wall and looked at her. "Mae, I want to say something and I would ask you to hear me out before you answer." She set down her pencil and folded her hands on the account book and looked at him with the careful, steady attention she gave everything. "I know that I hurt you," Cole said. "I know that I left in the worst possible way and that I stayed away for 10 years and that nothing I say now can undo any of that. I know all of that. But I want you to know that leaving you was the worst mistake I have ever made, and I have made some considerable mistakes, and I am not saying this to ask you for anything right now. I am saying it because it is true and because you deserve to hear it from me directly." Mae was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked between them. "Thank you for saying it," she said at last. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I can see that you do." She looked down at her account book and then back up at him. "Cole, I am not a young girl anymore who goes wherever her feelings lead her. I am 26 years old and I run a business and I have built a life here. I am not the same person I was when you left. I know that. And you are not the same person either." "No," he agreed. "I am not. So if there is something here worth exploring," she said carefully, "then it would have to be explored honestly and slowly, like two people who are starting from now and not from 10 years ago. Do you understand what I mean?" "I understand exactly what you mean," Cole said. "All right then," she said, and picked up her pencil and went back to her accounts. But the corner of her mouth was turned up, just slightly, and Cole saw it, and it was the best thing he had seen in 10 years. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Cole would rise early and help me with whatever morning tasks needed doing, chopping wood, carrying water, repairing whatever had the boarding house's constant need for repair. And then he would ride out to his land and work through the morning and into the afternoon, clearing brush and mending the corral fence and making the cabin livable. In the evenings he came back to the boarding house, ate supper with the other guests, and afterward found reasons to linger in the kitchen. Mae allowed this. More than allowed it. She began to seem, after that first week, genuinely glad of his presence in a way she could not quite suppress even when she was trying to maintain her careful composure. She would find herself laughing at something he said, and then look slightly startled at the sound of her own laughter, as though it had surprised her. She began to ask about his land, specific and intelligent questions about the grass and the water, and how many head he thought he could carry through a Kansas winter. And the conversation stretched longer and longer into the evenings, until the lamp burned low, and the other guests were long in their beds. The town watched all of this with great interest. Caldwell was not a large town, and the return of Cole Reardon and his installation at Mae Whitfield's boarding house was considerable news. People had opinions, as people always do. Some, like Tom Garrett and his wife, were quietly encouraging. Others, like Mrs. Dunnigan, who ran the dry goods store and had a gift for righteous disapproval, made it known that they thought Cole Reardon had a great deal to answer for, and that Mae was too good for him and too smart to be taken in again. Mae heard all of this, because small towns do not permit privacy, and it seemed to make her more rather than less careful in what she showed publicly. She was correct and composed whenever she and Cole were in the company of others, and it was only in the privacy of the kitchen, or on the back porch on warm evenings, that she let her guard down enough to be truly herself with him. It was on the back porch on a Wednesday evening in his second week, when the other guests were inside, and the night was warm and smelled of hay from the stable and something sweet from the neighbor's garden, that the conversation finally turned toward everything they had not yet said. They had been talking about nothing in particular, the railroad and what it was doing to the cattle trade, the peculiar drought of 1881 and how the grass had come back, and then they fell into a comfortable silence, and in the silence Mae said, "I read your letters so many times the paper fell apart at the folds." Cole was still. "I kept them," she said, "all three, in a cedar box under my bed. I still have them." "Mae, I am not saying this to make you feel guilty," she said quickly. "I am past that mostly. I am saying it because I want you to understand that that there was never a time when I simply stopped. Do you understand what I am saying?" "Yes," Cole said, and his voice was rougher than he intended. "I do." She was quiet again, looking out at the yard, and then she said, "There were two men who wanted to court me seriously, decent men. I turned them both down and could not explain why. Not really. My mother said it was because I had a stubborn heart." A pause. "She was probably right." "Your mother was almost always right," Cole said, which was true and which made me smile. "She liked you, you know," Mae said, "even after you left. She would not say anything against you. She said she thought you were a fool but not a bad man, and those are not the same thing." Cole pressed his hands together between his knees and looked at them. "She was more generous than I deserved." "She was right again," Mae said. "You are not a bad man, Cole. You were a frightened boy who made a frightened choice. I understand that now better than I did then." She turned to look at him in the lamplight from the kitchen window, and her face was open in a way he had not seen since his first evening back. "But understanding it does not mean it did not hurt." "I know," he said. "God, Mae, I know. I am so sorry." The words were quiet and direct, without embellishment or decoration, just the plain truth of them, and something in Mae's face shifted. "I know you are," she said. They sat together on the porch for another hour after that, talking about things both small and large, and when Mae finally said good night and went inside, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "I am glad you came back," she said, and went in before he could answer. He sat alone on the porch in the warm Kansas night and felt something enormous and light move through his chest, like the beginning of weather. The following Saturday, Caldwell held its monthly market day, and Main Street was crowded from early morning with wagons and buyers and sellers and children running between the adults' legs. Mae had a standing arrangement with the town to provide coffee and biscuits from a table outside the boarding house, which she set up every market morning and which was reliably popular, and Cole showed up without being asked and hauled the table out of the kitchen and set it up in the right spot and helped her carry the coffee urns without a word of discussion about it. Mae looked at him when he set down the second urn. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," Cole said, and smiled at her, and she pressed her lips together against a smile of her own and busied herself arranging cups. The market was a lively affair. Farmers from the surrounding country came in with produce and grain and livestock. The cattle buyers circulated importantly. Children darted among the stalls. There was a trio of fiddle players setting up near the hardware store, and by mid-morning they had drawn a crowd and were playing reels that turned the air festive. Cole stayed near the coffee table, talking to people he knew, and being introduced to people who had arrived in Caldwell during his absence, watching me move through the crowd with her characteristic combination of warmth and competence. It was during the market that he first noticed the man watching her. He was a solidly built man in his mid-30s, well-dressed in the way of a successful merchant, with a careful mustache and steady eyes. He had stationed himself near me's coffee table in a way that seemed casual but had purpose in it, refilling his cup twice without drinking much, and he spoke to me with a familiarity that suggested he had been trying to build something there. His name turned out to be Roy Decker. Cole learned this from Tom Garrett, who came by for coffee and made easy conversation, mentioning Decker as the man who had bought out the old Jennings Mercantile and expanded it into the largest general store in 3 counties. Tom mentioned it in a tone that was deliberately neutral, but his eyes moved briefly to Cole's face as he said it, checking for a reaction. "He has been friendly toward me for about a year," Tom added in the same casual tone. "She has been perfectly cordial to him, not much more than that." "She is cordial to everyone," Cole said. "She is," Tom agreed and walked away. Later that day, as Cole was helping me carry the coffee table back inside, Decker appeared at the boarding house gate and lifted his hat. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "excellent coffee as always. Market day would not be the same without it." "Thank you, Mr. Decker," me said pleasantly. Decker's eyes moved to Cole with a measured quality that was not quite unfriendly but was certainly assessing. "Roy Decker," he said, extending a hand. "Cole Reardon," Cole said and shook it. "I have heard the name," Decker said. His tone gave nothing away. "You are taking over the old Peabody place north of town." "I am," Cole said. "Good land up there," Decker said. "Good water." He turned back to me. "I was wondering if you might be free for supper at the hotel dining room this Saturday evening, Miss Whitfield." Me's response was seamless and kind. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Decker. I am afraid Saturday evenings are quite busy for me at the boarding house." "Of course," Decker said without any apparent deflation. "Another time perhaps." He lifted his hat again and walked away. Cole and me carried the table into the kitchen without speaking. When they set it down, Cole looked at her. "He asks frequently," Cole said. "Often enough," me said, and her tone was even. "And your answer is always—" "My answer is always that I am busy," me said, meeting his eyes. Cole looked at her for a moment. "Me," he said. "Do not start," she said, but not unkindly, and there was something in her eyes that he could feel in his chest. He did not start. But he thought about it for the rest of the day, and what he thought was that he had wasted 10 years already, and he was not inclined to waste any more. The following week, he began in earnest to put the cabin on his land into proper shape. He had decided to build onto it, add a proper second room and a covered porch, and enlarge the fireplace, and had engaged Tom Garrett to supply the lumber and a local man named Briggs who was known for his construction work to advise on the framing. Cole did most of the physical work himself, which Tom thought was admirable and Briggs thought was efficient, and which Cole found deeply satisfying in the way that physical work can satisfy when it has purpose and direction behind it. He also spent 2 days in late August riding to ranch country south of Caldwell to look at cattle, and came back having put money down on 15 head of mixed stock that would be delivered to his land in September. 15 was a modest start, but a start, and the grass was good and the water was reliable, and he thought he could build on it, given time. Me noticed the progress with a careful attention. She asked questions that were specific and practical. How deep was the well? Was the chimney sound? What did the cabin look like facing east in the morning? And Cole answered every question honestly, and with a detail that was not accidental, because he wanted her to be able to picture it, to place herself in it. One Thursday evening he asked if she would like to ride out and see the property. She was quiet for a moment. On what occasion? She asked. On the occasion of me wanting to show you something I am proud of, Cole said, and you being someone whose opinion matters to me. She considered this. Sunday afternoon is usually my free time, she said, after church and the midday meal. Sunday afternoon it is, Cole said. He brought a gentle mare from the stable on Sunday, because Ranger was a working horse and not built for a lady's comfort, and had borrowed the mare from old Hector Bliss, who had more horses than he needed, and had offered without being asked when he heard Cole mention the Sunday plan to Tom Garrett. Hector Bliss, Cole had concluded, was a man who watched the world more carefully than he let on. Me came out of the boarding house after the midday meal in a dress the color of cornflowers, her hair pinned up under a small hat, and she looked at the mare and then at Cole and said, "That is Hector's mare." "He lent her," Cole said. "Hector Bliss, who sat in his chair staring at you for 3 days when you first came back." "The same," Cole said. Me shook her head with a small smile and let Cole help her mount, and he swung up onto Ranger and they rode north out of town together in the Sunday afternoon sunshine, and Caldwell watched them go with a universal pretense of minding its own business. The land was beautiful in September light. The grass had the gold of the season beginning to come into it, and the creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and the cottonwoods were just starting to turn. Cole showed me the boundaries, riding slowly along the creek and then up through the higher grass to where the cabin sat on a slight rise with a good view south toward town. He had been working on it long enough by now that it looked like something. The new room was framed and half-walled. The porch was rebuilt and sound. The original room of the cabin was clean and dry, and had a functional fireplace and a proper plank floor that Cole had put in himself, replacing the old packed earth. He had built a table and 2 chairs from lumber left over from the construction, and there was a cast iron stove in the corner that he had hauled out from town. Me stood in the middle of the cabin and turned slowly, taking it all in. The afternoon light came through the 2 windows and lay in warm rectangles on the new floor. "You built this table?" she asked, putting her hand on it. "I did," Cole said. "It is not fine work." "It is solid work," Me said. "Solid is better than fine." She ran her hand along the edge of it and then looked out the window at the creek below and the grass beyond. "Cole," she said quietly. "Yes." She turned to face him, and there in the warm afternoon light of the cabin he was building with his own hands, with the sound of the creek and the wind in the grass outside and nothing between them but the 10 years they had both survived. Mae Whitfield looked at Cole Reardon with her whole face open and unguarded. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said. That leaving me was the worst mistake you ever made." "I meant it," Cole said. "I know." She paused. "I have also been thinking about what I said. About starting from now as 2 people who are not the same as they were." "Yes," Cole said carefully. "I think that was right," she said. "I think starting from now is the only honest way to do it. But starting from now does not mean I have to pretend that the time before now did not happen, or that I do not remember what it felt like to love you." Cole's breath was very careful. "Does it still feel like that?" he asked. "When you are being honest with yourself?" Me held his gaze for a long, steady moment. "Yes," she said simply. "It does." He crossed the cabin in 2 steps and took her hands in both of his, and she did not pull away. Her hands were warm and real and familiar in a way that went past memory into something deeper, something that lived in the body, and he held them with a care that was almost reverent. "Then I am asking you to give me the chance to be the man I should have been 10 years ago," Cole said. "Not the frightened boy who ran, the man I know I can be if you will have me." "I am not in the business of promising what I do not know," Me said, but her hands tightened on his. "But I am willing. I told you that." "That is all I am asking," Cole said. "I will do the rest." She looked up at him, and what was in her face was not the soft, easy feeling of first love, but something heavier and truer, something tested, and she said, "Then do not make me regret it." "I will not," Cole said. "I swear to you, me." She believed him. She had not let herself believe anything about Cole Reardon in 10 years, but she believed this because she had been watching him for 3 weeks, and she knew a man who had made peace with himself from a man who was still at war, and Cole was the former, finally. He walked her back to the horses through the long grass, and they rode back to town in the golden light of the September afternoon, and this time when Cole helped her dismount, she did not step back immediately but stayed for a moment close to him, and he looked at her with everything in his face that he had been careful not to show too plainly. And she smiled at him, really smiled, not the careful, polite smile she gave her guests, but the full, open one that had always made him feel like the sun had come out. And then she went inside. The weeks that followed were the best of Cole's adult life. They were not dramatic weeks, not full of grand gestures or spectacular declarations. They were better than that. They were Sunday afternoon rides and evenings on the porch and long conversations that covered everything from the practical to the personal. Cole brought me wildflowers he had found along the creek, not as a deliberate romantic gesture, but because he had seen them and thought of her, which was how the best gifts work. Me brought him supper in a covered pail on days when he was working too hard at the cabin to come back into town, and they would eat together by the creek in the late afternoon with Ranger and the borrowed mare grazing nearby, talking about everything and nothing. He was careful with her in all the ways he had not been careful before. He was present. He showed up. He did what he said he would do. He listened when she talked about difficult things, the years of running the boarding house alone, her mother's illness, the way the town had changed, and he told her in return the parts of the last 10 years that were hard to say. The months in New Mexico territory when he had worked for a man he was not proud to have worked for, driving cattle that may not have all been legally obtained. The winter in Colorado when he had been genuinely alone, the kind of alone that is not peaceful but hollow, and had sat by a fire in a lined shack for 3 days of a blizzard, and thought about her with such clarity that it had been almost physical pain. Me listened to all of it, and she did not offer easy absolution, because she was not that kind of person, but she understood, which was better. Roy Decker issued one more invitation, a formal and polite one delivered by note to the boarding house in October, asking if me might join him for the harvest social at the church hall. Me wrote a note back, equally polite, declining and making it clear that she was keeping company with someone, which was the manner in which such things were communicated in Caldwell, Kansas in 1883. Decker did not push further after that, and Cole respected him for it, because the man had behaved well throughout, even if his timing had been unfortunate. Walt Sayers found Cole at the hardware store one afternoon and looked at him with a measuring expression. "You seem different than the first day you came back," Walt said. "Probably because I am," Cole said. "Me seems different too," Walt said. "She has been smiling more. I know it is not the new porch board." Cole laughed, the easy, genuine laugh of a man who is happy, and Walt Sayers looked at him and shook his head with what was clearly reluctant satisfaction. "All right," Walt said. "All right." The cattle arrived in late September, 15 head of good mixed stock that Cole drove the last stretch himself from the south holding pens with the help of a young man named Danny Prout, who was 17 and eager and had appeared at Cole's cabin one morning asking for work. Cole had given him part-time work and was glad of it, because the cattle meant there was real work to be done, and Danny was quick and willing. By October the cabin's new room was complete, the corral was strong, and the cattle were settled on the grass north of the creek, moving fat and content in the September warmth. Cole had 15 head and 40 acres, and a solid, clean cabin and a growing certainty about the future that felt nothing like the constriction he had feared as a young man. It felt like freedom of a different and better kind. The freedom of a man who knows where he belongs and what he wants, and is no longer running from either thing. On a Sunday afternoon in early October, with the cottonwoods along the creek turned fully golden and the air carrying the first real bite of autumn, Cole and me sat on the cabin porch he had built, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small box made of dark wood and set it on the table between them. Me looked at the box. Then she looked at him. "Cole," she said very quietly. "Open it," he said. She opened it. Inside was a ring, not elaborate, not the sort of thing a wealthy man would give, but a fine thing nonetheless. A slim gold band with a small garnet that caught the afternoon light like a piece of the sunset held in metal. He had ridden to Wichita for it, a day each way, because Caldwell's single jeweler had nothing that seemed right. "I am not asking you to decide right now," Cole said. "I am asking you to look at it and know what my intentions are. If you need time, I will give you all the time you need." Me looked at the ring for a long moment. The creek ran below them. The golden leaves moved in the light wind. "Cole Reardon," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "You rode all the way to Wichita for this." "I did." "On a weekday, Monday and Tuesday," he confirmed. "Briggs thought you had gone to look at more cattle," Me said. "I let him think so," Cole admitted. Me looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something she was not trying very hard to contain. "I do not need time," she said. Cole went still. "I have had 10 years of time," Me said. "I know my own heart better than I have ever known anything, and my heart says that whatever sense or caution or pride might tell me otherwise, the answer is yes. The answer has been yes since you came back down that hill on your roan horse and I dropped a pan in the yard." She paused. "Yes, Cole." He took the ring out of the box and put it on her finger, and his hands were not steady, which was new, and Me laughed a little and held his hand still while he worked the ring onto her finger. And then she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. And there was so much in her face. The years and the hurt and the sweetness of now and the plain certainty of being exactly right, that Cole felt it like weather moving through him. He kissed her then, gently, with the care of a man who knows what he has and does not intend to treat it carelessly. She kissed him back with the warmth and steadiness of a woman who had waited long enough and was done waiting. The wind moved through the golden cottonwoods, and Ranger cropped grass in the corral below them, and Caldwell, Kansas lay warm and ordinary in the distance under the big October sky. They were married in November in the Caldwell church, on a day when the Kansas wind had teeth in it, but the sun was bright, and the church was warm with people and lamplight. Me wore a dress the color of cream with blue ribbon trim that she had made herself, and she looked so beautiful that even Mrs. Dunnigan, who had predicted nothing good would come of any of this, had to press her handkerchief to her eyes during the vows. Cole wore his best clothes and a clean shave and looked, according to Tom Garrett's wife Helen, like a man who had finally figured out what he was doing with his life. Walt Sayers stood up with Cole as his witness, and Me's closest friend in Caldwell, a cheerful widow named Clara Hobbs who ran the millinery shop on 2nd Street, stood with me. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Aldous who had come to Caldwell 2 years prior and had a gentle manner and a steady voice, and he read the words of the ceremony with the attention that good words deserve. When Cole said, "I do," his voice did not waver. When Me said it, she looked directly at him, and the whole weight of everything, the years they had spent apart, the ways they had both changed and grown, the long patient waiting of her love and the long fearful running of his, was present in the room with them and was transformed by the simplest possible words into something that was only forward-looking, only hopeful, only full of promise. The reception was held in the church hall, with the fiddle players from Market Day providing music, and there was food in abundance because the women of Caldwell had all brought something, and there was dancing, and Cole danced with Me in the way that a man dances with his wife for the first time, which is to say with great seriousness and also great joy. Hector Bliss came to the wedding in his Sunday suit and shook Cole's hand with the force of a man 20 years younger and said, "You took long enough, but you got there," which was both a reprimand and a blessing, and Cole took it as both. Even Roy Decker came, because Caldwell was not a large town and the wedding was a public occasion. And he congratulated me with a warmth that was genuine and congratulated Cole with the measured respect of a man who has accepted a loss gracefully. And Cole shook his hand with equal respect because the man had earned it. The night after the wedding they stayed at the boarding house, in Me's room on the second floor, because the cabin was not yet set up for winter living in the way Me needed for comfort. She had standards about such things, and they were good standards, and they lay in the dark with the November wind against the windows and talked quietly about the future, about the changes she would need to make to hand off the boarding house management, about the cattle and the land, about all the practical and beautiful logistics of two lives becoming one. "I am going to be an honest cattleman's wife," Me said, with a thread of amusement in her voice. "You are going to be a formidable one," Cole said. "Those cattle will not know what has happened to them." Me laughed, and it was the best sound in the world. She did not sell the boarding house because it was her mother's and hers, and she had built it into something real, and she did not intend to simply hand it away. Instead, she made an arrangement with a capable woman named Ida Stern, a widow of 40 who had been looking for exactly such a situation, to manage the boarding house on a share of the revenue basis, with me keeping oversight and doing the accounts. It was a sensible arrangement that suited everyone and gave me the ability to divide her time between the boarding house and the cabin on the land north of town, which was what she intended to do. She made the cabin into a home with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. She brought furniture piece by piece from town, the good pieces from her room at the boarding house, and several pieces she had stored in the stable. She hung curtains in the windows and put a braided rug on the plank floor, and arranged the kitchen things with the care of a woman who understands that a kitchen is the center of a house. She planted bulbs along the south wall of the cabin before the ground froze, so there would be flowers in spring. Cole watched all of this with a feeling that did not have a precise name but lived in the chest, warm and constant, like a fire well laid. Winter came to Kansas with the bluntness it always does, early and heavy, but the cabin held the cold out well, and the fireplace drew cleanly, and the cast-iron stove in the kitchen kept them warm through the worst of it. The cattle had good shelter in the corral, and the lean-to Cole had built against the north fence, and Danny Prout came out 3 mornings a week even in the cold to help with the feeding and the ice breaking in the water trough, because he was that kind of young man. Cole and me spent the winter evenings by the fire in ways that were both ordinary and extraordinary, reading, talking, playing cards, sitting in comfortable silence. Cole had books from his years of travel, a small collection that me added to from her own, and they read to each other sometimes, which she had not done with anyone since her mother was alive, and which turned out to be one of the things Cole loved best about their evenings together. He told her so, and she looked up from the page she was reading and said, "You love that." "I love everything about this," Cole said, meaning the fire and the book and the rug and the curtains and her in the chair across from him and all of it. Me's expression did something quiet and private that was not quite a smile and was better than one. "I love everything about this too," she said, and went back to her reading. There was a difficult week in January when 2 of Cole's cattle took sick with a respiratory ailment that the vet in town said had been moving through some of the county herds. Cole lost 1 animal and nursed the second through 10 cold days with a combination of the vet's prescribed treatments and a stubbornness that refused to lose another head. Me helped without complaint or hesitation, in the way she helped with everything completely and practically, and without making it a larger thing than it was. When the second animal was clearly on the mend, standing solid and eating normally one bright January morning, Cole came into the kitchen and found me at the stove and put his arms around her from behind and held her without saying anything for a long moment. "She is going to be fine," he said into her hair. "I know," Me said. "I could see it this morning." "I do not think I said thank you," Cole said, "for this week, for all of it." Me turned in his arms and looked up at him. You do not thank your partner for doing what partners do, she said. He kissed her forehead, and she settled against him for a moment in the warm kitchen. And outside, the January wind moved across the Kansas plain, cold and indifferent, as it had always done and would always do. Spring came the way it comes in Kansas, with great sudden warmth after a final fierce week of cold, and the world turned green almost overnight. Mae's bulbs came up along the south wall of the cabin, yellow and purple, and she stood looking at them one morning with her coffee cup in both hands and a look of simple pleasure on her face that Cole wished he could keep in a box the way she had kept his letters. The cattle had come through the winter well, all 14 surviving head fat and healthy, and Cole rode down to the stockyards in April to look at buying more. He came back with 5 additional head, and the news that the cattle market was strong and that his land, properly managed, could carry 30 head without strain. 30 head, Mae said that evening, with the ledger book open on the kitchen table working figures. By what year? 3 years, Cole said, if we have 2 good grass seasons. That would make us quite comfortable, Mae said, making a note. We are already quite comfortable, Cole said, and she looked up at him and smiled. In May, Mae sat down across from Cole at the kitchen table one Sunday morning and folded her hands in the particular way that meant she had something considered to say. I think I am expecting, she said. Cole set down his coffee mug. Me, he said, and his voice did something entirely ungoverned. I am not certain yet, she said, but I believe so. He got up from his chair and came around the table and kneeled beside hers and took her hands, and she looked at him with a tenderness that was almost unbearable, and he said, Are you all right? How do you feel? I feel fine, she said. I feel better than fine. I feel extraordinarily fine. A pause. Are you all right? I am so far past all right, Cole said, that I do not know what word to use. She laughed, and he pressed her hands to his lips, and the May morning came through the window full of birdsong and new warmth. The certainty of the pregnancy grew over the following weeks, and by June it was a confirmed fact that Caldwell received with the warm, possessive interest a small town takes in good news. Clara Hobbs came out to the cabin with a basket of baby things she had been quietly accumulating for months, claiming she had simply had a feeling, which no one disputed because Clara Hobbs's feelings were generally reliable. Tom Garrett's wife Helen brought a blanket she had knitted herself in cream-colored wool with a border of small blue crosses. Even Hector Bliss was heard to say, at the barber shop, that it was about time. Mrs. Dunnigan, who had come around considerably since the wedding, baked a pound cake and brought it to the boarding house with a note for me that said she was very pleased and hoped for a healthy baby, which was as warm as Mrs. Dunnigan generally got and was well received. Cole worked through the summer with the focused energy of a man who has reasons stacked upon reasons. The land was producing. The cattle were thriving. He hired Danny Pruitt on full-time from June onward, and Danny proved to be everything Cole had hoped: steady, quick to learn, honest about his mistakes and eager to correct them. Danny had no family nearby, his people having moved on to Colorado territory, and he took his meals at the cabin most days, and Mae fed him with the same generous efficiency she fed everyone, and Danny was clearly somewhat in awe of her, which Cole understood completely. One August evening, the first anniversary of Cole's return to Caldwell, he and Mae sat on the cabin porch in the warm dark with the sound of the creek below them and the stars overhead, and Mae said, "A year ago today." "I know," Cole said. "I dropped the dishpan. I heard it from 40 feet away." Mae was quiet for a moment. "I thought my heart had simply stopped working," she said. "I was standing there in the yard and I saw you coming down the street and I thought that cannot possibly be, and then you took your hat off and it was. I thought you might tell me to leave," Cole said. "I thought about it," Mae admitted, "for about 2 seconds. What changed your mind? You held your hat in your hands," she said. "The way you always did when you were nervous. You rolled the brim. I remembered that and I thought, he is still Cole. Whatever else has happened, he is still himself." She paused. "And then I went inside because I needed a moment that was not in front of you." Cole reached over and took her hand in his, and she laced her fingers through his. "I am glad you did not tell me to leave," he said. "So am I," Mae said. "Every day." The baby was born in late November 1884, in the cabin with the midwife Mrs. Holler attending and Cole pacing the porch in the cold with Danny for company, both of them drinking coffee that was long cold and pretending not to be frightened. When Mrs. Holler opened the door and said, "Mr. Reardon, you have a son," Cole walked inside on legs that were not entirely reliable and went to where Mae lay in their bed with the child in her arms. And the child was pink and fierce-looking, and had his mother's dark eyes. And Cole looked at his wife and his son in the lamplight, and felt something move through him that was larger than any feeling he had words for gratitude and love, and the humbling weight of having been given something he had not deserved, and had somehow arrived at anyway. "He is perfect," Cole said. "He is," Mae agreed with the certain tiredness of a woman who has just done something considerable. "What shall we call him?" Cole asked. Mae looked down at the baby and then up at Cole. "James," she said, "after your father." Cole's throat tightened. "My father was not always a happy man," he said. "No," Mae said, "but he worked hard and he loved his family, and James is a good name, and you are already a better man than your fears told you that you would be. So let us give the name something new to mean." Cole leaned down and kissed her forehead very gently, and then the top of his son's small dark head. "James it is," he said. James Reardon grew into the world with the same combination of his mother's steadiness and his father's curiosity that made him, by general agreement, a particularly engaging child. He had Mae's dark hair and Cole's blue eyes, which Clara Hobbs declared was an entirely unfair concentration of good qualities in one small person. He was walking by 10 months and talking in recognizable sentences by 18, which Mae attributed to the fact that they talked to him constantly, which Cole had insisted on from the beginning. Cole's herd reached 22 head by the spring of 1886, and the grass was as good as he had hoped, and Danny Prout had grown from an eager boy into a genuinely capable young ranch hand who could be trusted with the cattle for days at a time, while Cole attended to other business. The cabin had a proper kitchen addition now, with real storage and a larger stove, and Mae had made a garden that was the envy of their nearest neighbors, the Hargrove family whose land ran along the east boundary of Cole's 40 acres. The boarding house continued to do well under Ida Stern's management, and Mae visited it 3 mornings a week to go over the books and handle any matters that required her specific attention. And Ida had become a genuine friend over the 2 years of their arrangement, the kind of steady, competent woman that Mae naturally drew to herself. On a warm evening in the spring of 1886, Mae and Cole sat on the porch of their cabin with James asleep inside and the smell of the new garden on the air, and Mae said, "I think James should have a sibling." Cole looked at her sidelong. "Is that so?" "He needs someone to argue with," Mae said serenely. "He has too many adults around him telling him he is wonderful." "He is wonderful," Cole said. "He absolutely is," Mae agreed. "And he needs someone who will not always tell him so." Cole laughed and reached across the small table on the porch and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his. "I think a sibling sounds right," Cole said. Their second child was born in January 1887, also at the cabin, also with Mrs. Holler attending, and this time Cole was somewhat less frightened than the first time, although Danny Prout still kept him company on the porch for the most important part, and they still drank cold coffee. The second child was a girl, and she announced her arrival with a force of personality that was audible from the porch, and Cole went inside to find me laughing with exhaustion and delight. "She is loud," Cole said. "She is magnificent," Mae said, which was true. They named her Alina, after Mae's mother, and Alina Reardon turned out to be exactly what Mae had predicted. James needed someone who would argue with him cheerfully and at length, and without any sign of backing down, which James found both exasperating and deeply interesting. In the summer of 1887, Caldwell held its 14th anniversary as a named town, and there was a celebration in the park near the church with music and food and speeches from the mayor, a round, pleasant man named Fulton who was genuinely fond of the town and showed it. Cole stood with me in the afternoon shade, James on his hip. The boy had recently discovered that being carried offered a superior view and had become insistent about this, and a leaner in me's arms, and they watched the celebrations with the simple pleasure of people who are exactly where they want to be. Walt Sayers came to stand beside Cole during one of the mayor's longer speeches and said, quietly, "You look like a man who has figured it out." "I think I have," Cole said. "You know," Walt said, "I was not kind to you on your first week back." "You were honest," Cole said. "That is better," Walt nodded slowly. "She is a fine woman, Cole." "The finest I know," Cole said. And me, who had heard this, turned slightly and pressed her lips together against a smile and pretended to be very interested in the mayor's speech. The years after that settled into the fullness that good lives settle into, not without difficulty, because no life is, but with the underlying foundation of two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and were determined to honor that choice through the ordinary and extraordinary requirements of their days together. There was a dry summer in 1888 that was hard on the cattle and required Cole to sell 3 head earlier than he would have liked and buy hay from a man near Wichita at a price that was uncomfortable. Me went over the accounts with him at the kitchen table 2 evenings running, and they made the adjustments that needed making and did not quarrel about it, which was the result of both their natures and the practice of two people who had learned how to talk to each other about hard things. There was the winter of 1889 when James had a fever that lasted 4 days, and neither Cole nor me slept more than an hour at a stretch, taking turns at his bedside. And when the fever finally broke on the 5th morning, they looked at each other over James's sleeping head with an exhausted and profound relief, and Cole put his arm around me, and she leaned against him, and they stayed like that for a long time. There was a leaner's habit of escaping the cabin yard with an ingenuity that seemed to increase with every fence improvement Cole made, and the summer when she was 3½ and they found her at the creek teaching herself to catch fish with her hands, which she had apparently figured out by careful observation of the herons, and me had looked at her daughter and said, "A leaner. You are going to give me gray hair," and a leaner had looked back with the expression of a person who considers this a reasonable exchange. There was the evening in 1890 when Danny Prout came to the cabin with a letter in his hand, and a look that was trying to be casual and failing. And when Cole asked him what was in the letter, Danny said it was an offer of a foreman position on a large ranch in Colorado, good wages and real responsibility, and a chance to build towards something. And Cole had looked at Danny, 24 years old now, honest and capable and ready, and had said, "You should go." Danny had looked uncertain. "I feel like I am leaving you in the lurch," he said. "You are not," Cole said. "We will manage, and you need to go do what you are ready to do. Do not let fear of leaving keep you somewhere you have outgrown." He had said the last part without quite intending to, and me, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, had met his eyes over Danny's head with a warmth that acknowledged everything that was unspoken in the statement. Danny had gone to Colorado, and they did manage, and Cole hired a capable local man named Abe Torres to take on Danny's work. Abe was 30, experienced with cattle, and had been working smaller jobs around the county since coming up from Texas 2 years prior. He was quiet and thorough, and had a gift with horses that Cole respected deeply, and within a month he had become as much a fixture of the operation as Danny had been. The land had grown. Cole had bought an additional 20 acres from the Hargrove family when old Tom Hargrove decided to retire and move in with his son in Wichita, and the 60 acres now carried 28 head of good cattle and had a reputation in the county for sound management and fair dealing. Cole was not rich by any measure, but he was solid and respected, and the work he did was his own, which was what he had always wanted without knowing how to want it honestly. Me's boarding house had expanded under Ida's management to 7 rooms, which made it the largest in Caldwell, and the railroad traffic had been good for business in ways that Mae had predicted when she first read about the line extension in 1885. Mae still kept the accounts and provided general oversight, and still had opinions about how the kitchen operated that Ida accepted with the pragmatic wisdom of someone who had tasted Mae's biscuits and understood the high stakes involved. One October evening in 1890, with James nearly 6 years old and a leaner 3 and the land golden in the autumn light, Cole came in from the evening chores to find me at the kitchen table with the cedar box in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. Mae looked up. She did not look troubled, only thoughtful. "I was sorting through some things in the bedroom," she said, "and I found this." Cole came and sat across from her. The cedar box sat between them. It was a small plain box, dark with age, with a simple brass clasp. "The letters," Cole said. "The letters," Mae agreed. She put her hand on the lid of the box. "I thought about burning them a few years ago, right after James was born. I thought I did not need them anymore." She paused, "but I did not burn them." "Why not?" Cole asked. Mae considered this for a moment, her hand resting on the lid of the box. "Because they are part of it," she said finally. "They are part of how we got here, the pain of them and the waiting and all of it. And if I burn them, I am pretending that part did not happen, and it did happen, and I do not want to pretend it did not." She looked up at him. "Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," Cole said. "I think I want to keep them," Mae said. "Not to look at them, just to know they are there. The way you know a scar is there even when you are not looking at it. It is part of the story." "Then keep them," Cole said. Mae nodded and closed the clasp on the cedar box and set it aside. Then she reached across the table and took Cole's hand. "You know what I know better than I have ever known anything," she said. "What?" Cole asked. "That I would not have wanted a different story," Mae said. "Even the hard parts, because the hard parts are what made us sure. I am sure of you, Cole. I am more sure of you than I have ever been of anything." Cole turned his hand over and held hers. "I am sure of you too," he said. "I have been sure since before I had the courage to say so." Outside the kitchen window the October evening was quiet and wide, the Kansas sky going dark at the edges and holding still bright along the west, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The fire was going in the main room, and the sounds of the children settling toward sleep drifted from their room, James's low, serious voice asking Alina something and Alina's firm reply, and then silence. The cattle were quiet in the corral. Ranger, who was old now and mostly retired from hard work, stood in the barn in his familiar dignity. Cole looked at me across their kitchen table and thought about all the roads he had ridden, and all the fires he had sat beside alone, and all the nights he had talked himself out of and into and out of again the decision to come home, and thought about how strange and right it was that the bravest thing he had ever done was ride down a hill into a town he had left and face the person he had wronged. And me looked at Cole and thought about 10 years of keeping a cedar box under a bed and loving someone with the stubbornness that her mother had named accurately, and the patience that she herself had not known she possessed, and thought that love, in its truest form, is not a feeling that happens to you but a choice that you make, again and again, sometimes in the face of grief and sometimes in the face of ordinary life, and it gets more itself with every year you choose it. "Come here," Cole said, and me came around the table and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and the lamp burned warm between them and the autumn dark settled gently over the Kansas plain. Their life went on, as good lives do, with all its ordinary days and its particular joys. And in the spring of 1891, they had a third child, another son they named William, who arrived in April with the meadowlarks singing outside the cabin windows, and who grew to have Cole's square hands and me's steady eyes and James's habit of taking things apart to see how they worked, which kept the household in a state of ongoing interest. By the middle of the decade, the Reardon land was known in Caldwell County as one of the better-run small cattle operations in the region, and Cole was sometimes asked by younger men who were setting out for his advice, which he gave freely and without embellishment, always including the importance of honesty and patience and the willingness to stay. James, who was 12 by then, could ride and rope and keep accounts, and had me's gift for numbers and Cole's gift for reading the land, and everyone who knew him agreed that he was going to be something worth watching. Eleanor, 9, had not changed substantially in her fundamental nature since the fish-catching incident, and continued to be a force of remarkable self-determination. William followed his siblings around with the devoted admiration of a youngest child, and was entirely convinced that everything they did was wonderful. Mae continued to run her life with the same practical grace that had always been her way, managing the boarding house and the household and the accounts and the garden and 3 children and 1 husband without ever appearing overwhelmed, although Cole knew better than anyone that this was not because she was beyond difficulty, but because she met difficulty head-on and moved through it, and did not give it more space than it had earned. There were evenings still, most evenings in fact, when they sat on the cabin porch in the warm months or by the fire in the cold ones, and talked about the day and about what was coming and about nothing in particular. And Cole would look at me in the lamplight with the children asleep inside, and the land quiet outside, and feel the full weight of what his life was, and what it could have been if he had not gathered the courage to ride back down that hill, and the feeling was not guilt any more but gratitude. The clean and specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he has, and exactly what it cost. One autumn evening, with James 14 and Eleanor 11 and William 7, the 3 of them came in from various outdoor enterprises, and sat at the supper table with the focused appetite of children who have spent the day in productive chaos. And Cole looked down the table at me at the other end, and she looked back at him. And something passed between them that did not need words because it had been built word by word over years of choosing each other, and was now as solid as the plank floor under their feet. James noticed this the way children always notice the things happening between their parents that the parents do not know they are showing, and he said, with the directness of a 14-year-old who has thought about something, "You two do that all the time." "Do what?" Mae asked. "Look at each other like that," James said. "Like you are saying something without talking." Cole smiled. Mae pressed her lips together against the same. "That is because we have been talking to each other long enough to know what the other one means," Mae said. "How long?" William asked, because William was at the age of specific questions. "Since before you were born," Mae said. "Since before any of you were born. But you were apart for a while," James said, because James had been told the outline of the story in the particular way that children are told the outlines of things, the shape of it without all the weight. "We were," Cole said. "But you came back," James said. "I came back," Cole said. James seemed to find this acceptable and turned his attention to the biscuits. Eleanor had been listening with the private thoughtfulness she sometimes showed when something interested her underneath the surface, and she said, without looking up from her plate, "I am glad you came back, Papa." The simple certainty of it, stated in Eleanor's practical way as though it were merely a useful fact to confirm, landed on Cole like sunlight. "So am I," Cole said. "Every day." Mae was quiet at the other end of the table, and when Cole looked at her, she was looking at him with everything, all of it, the whole of what they were and had been and would be, in her steady dark eyes. And he held her gaze across the supper table with the fire going in the next room and the children around them, and the Kansas autumn pressing warm and close against the cabin windows, and it was the most complete thing he had ever felt in his life. This was what love came to, when it was given the chance and the time and the honest work it required. Not the first kiss on a porch in 1869, and not the heartbreak of a letter in 1873, and not the dropped dishpan in 1883, but this. This table, these children, these ordinary evenings. This woman across from him who had kept his letters and waited without admitting she was waiting, and had opened the door when he came back, and had been, from the first moment to the last, the most courageously loving person he had ever known. He had been afraid of love becoming a chain. What he had found, After all the years and all the miles and all the long roads that had finally brought him home, was that love was not a chain at all. It was the ground under your feet. It was the thing that made you know where you were and gave you the courage to be there. Reardon poured the coffee and passed the biscuits and listened to his children's voices fill the cabin. And across the table, Mae laughed at something Alina said, and the sound of it moved through the warm room like light through new curtains. And outside, the Kansas night was wide and full of stars, the same stars that had hung over the boarding house porch in 1869, when a nervous young man had said 3 words with such terrified earnestness that a 16-year-old girl had laughed and cried and kissed him. And the same stars that had watched him ride out of town before sunrise one summer morning in 1873, and the same stars that had kept their indifferent counsel over all the years between, and now they shone down on a cabin north of Caldwell, where a man and a woman had built something real and lasting out of all that had come before. And the night was good, and the fire was warm, and they were home.